For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching The Gist. Glad to be joined from London by David Loyn. He's a well-known name in India, has been the BBC's correspondent both in Afghanistan and in India in a career that lasted over 35 years. He's been President Ghani's strategic communications advisor for about a year. He's currently a senior visiting scholar at the War Studies Department of King's College London, and there's a forthcoming book which will be timed for 9/11, which is The Long War. David Loyn, thank you so much for giving us time on StratNews Global.
Very good to be with you, Amitabh. Thank you for the invitation.
Quickly getting into what's been happening over the last few days, we saw what happened in Qatar. Finally, Dr. Abdullah leading a delegation. You had Dr. Noor there. You had Dostum San Batur there with him as well. Khalili, who's there. Karzai was supposed to go, it didn't go, but nothing really happened apart from a joint statement, not even a temporary Eid ceasefire. Today at the ARG, President Ghani, while leading the Eid prayers, there were again rockets that fired, at least 3 of them near the presidential palace, to make some dramatic footage. How do you see all the developments in terms of the talk that the Taliban are doing, yet continuing with their military offensive on the ground?
Well, I think, Amitabh, they're not talking is the truth. And we saw that at the weekend, as you mentioned. 2 of the key leaders of the Mujahideen groups in the 1980s were among the group that went to Doha with Dr. Abdullah, the leader of the peace process, the head of the High Council for National Reconciliation in Afghanistan. And still there was no sense from the Taliban of moving towards an actual structure of negotiations. There's still talk of trying to set up commissions on the constitution, commissions on what kind of a government Afghanistan should have after this next stage, if the war ends. And the Taliban still won't agree to any of that. So there's a sense, an increasing sense, I think, in Afghanistan more widely. Well, what is this Islamic Emirate that they're talking about? What do they really mean? Because it's been very difficult for the Taliban to articulate it in Doha. So the talks, once again, although at that very high level, are stalled effectively in Doha. And of course, once again, today we saw in Kabul, as you mentioned, the propaganda of the deed, as people like to talk about terrorist acts of this sort, where the Taliban took that moment of the beginning of the prayers in the presidential palace and sent those rockets in. It's exactly what they did. I was there actually for the presidential inauguration of the second term of Ashraf Ghani in March last year. And again, there were rocket attacks that attempted to disrupt that event. So you see the Taliban trying to control the narrative all the time, claiming that they have taken 85% of Afghanistan, which they haven't, claiming that they're supported in the Pashtun areas. I agree very much with the piece on your website this week, saying that actually it's going to be far harder this time for the Taliban because they don't have the support in Pashtun areas that they did in the 1990s when they came into Afghanistan. And this disjunction really between the Taliban's quite coherent narrative, the way that they're putting themselves forward as a government in waiting, and the reality that no one knows what that government is. And when it comes to it on the ground, it remains the same rather brutal, rather dysfunctional relationship with the Afghan people that they had when they were in power in the late 1990s.
You're talking about the reality, and no one knows what happens when the Taliban comes into government, either by force or if there is some kind of agreement. But the reality that everybody is known for what's been called America's forever wars over 20 years is the reality across the Durand line, that the problem actually emanates from Pakistan. I just want to play out a soundbite of President Ashraf Ghani when he was speaking at the Tashkent Connectivity Conference, and he had Imran Khan on the same podium as him, and there was a bit of a tutu meme, as we call it in here in Delhi in Hindi. This is what President Ghani had to say about Pakistan.
Indicate the influx of over 10,000 jihadi fighters from Pakistan and other places in the last month, as well as support from their affiliates in the transnational terrorist organization. There's a consensus among credible international observers that they've not taken any steps to sever their relationship with terrorist organizations. Contrary to the repeated assurances by Prime Minister Khan and his generals that Pakistan does not find a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan in Pakistan's interest, in short of use of force, will use its power to influence to make the Taliban negotiate seriously. Networks and organizations supporting the Taliban are openly celebrating the destruction of the assets and capabilities of the Afghan people and state.
David, just taking some comments before you can make your remarks. Matara says, how does the Taliban excuse the violence during Eid? Prakhar Rustogi asks, will this withdrawal of Afghans' diplomatic missions have any costs inflicted on Pakistan? Pakistan itself, how do you view it, David, in terms of the Americans withdrawing now, no troops? So in essence, you don't have, that sword over the American head in terms of logistics or troops on the ground. Does that really change anything in addressing the actual problem?
I think if I could just take one bit of context on Pakistan. The United States have had a long-term alliance with Pakistan, going right back to the days of the Cold War. It's been quite hard for them to break that. And there is still a very strong sense in the United States that actually not destabilizing Pakistan is a very important thing for their foreign policy in the region. So, of course, Afghanistan matters, but they don't want to really push to the point where they destabilize Pakistan. And all of the ways that we see American foreign policy over Pakistan has to be seen against the context of that sense of not wanting Pakistan itself to collapse. And of course, the fear if Pakistan no longer has the ability to operate its own foreign policy in Afghanistan is that puts pressure on the Pakistani government. It's a very dysfunctional situation. It's quite hard to remember a time when relations between the two countries were as bad as they are. The reason for the breakdown in diplomatic relations is because the daughter of the Afghan ambassador to Islamabad was kidnapped and tortured. And that sort of really common abuse against the families of diplomats, of Afghan diplomats, has, of course, put relations into a very, very bad tailspin. In terms of the question about the Eid talks and the fact that the Taliban have carried out attacks on Eid, I think that's really in response to the fact that they offered a ceasefire for Eid if there were a release of prisoners. They wanted thousands more prisoners released. The Afghan government refused that. So the rockets were a very specific, and as I said before, a narrative response. They didn't have any tactical effects, those rockets. They had the effect of really of changing the views of the Afghan people, making the Afghan people think that the Taliban are stronger actually than possibly they are. But Pakistan does remain key to the future of Afghanistan. And of course, that wider regional context, we saw the Tashkent conference, is a very important part in sorting out whether Pakistan can be brought into the family of nations and can stop supporting the Afghan Taliban for the first time. China, of course, is key. China is one of the very few countries, really the only country in the world, with this so-called all-weather friendship with Pakistan, the country that can potentially influence Pakistan, and it's not done that yet in terms of stopping the war in Afghanistan. But if Afghanistan becomes more unstable, if it once again becomes a haven for international terrorism, we heard President Ghani there saying that he believes it already is, then I think we could potentially see China moving in, because of course the last thing they want is terrorists on their border. And remember that China has a border, of course, with Afghanistan along the Wakhan corridor, and that border goes right to the Uyghur region in China, which is the place where they've been trying to really control their own Islamist problem in the way that they see it. So I think China and Pakistan in this wider regional context is important. One of the things that President Ghani has done successfully, and I saw him doing this when I was working in his office 3 or 4 years ago, was this constant relationship with the Central Asian republics and trying to bring them on board on Afghanistan's side, not just against Pakistan, but to see Afghanistan as what he wants it to be, which is a country whose geography is no longer a problem, but a country whose geography can become a benefit, can become an advantage to it, that it can actually trade across the region. It can be he calls it the Central Asian roundabout. And I think you've seen in this really tireless sort of traveling that he's done to Central Asian republics, an effort to bring them in on Afghanistan's side and to say, look, we must isolate Pakistan as being the odd one out, the one country in the region that still wants to promote cross-border terrorism, as they clearly are still in Afghanistan. Thousands of potentially of people are coming from Pakistan. We've seen Taliban going back to madrasas in Pakistan for R&R, going to Pakistani hospitals for treatment. We've seen captured American military equipment going across the frontier in Pakistan for safekeeping. So you have a very dysfunctional situation between the two countries, and almost coming to blows at the Spin-Boldak border about a week ago. And Mullah, the Afghan vice president, came out very strongly saying Pakistan is threatening Afghan forces on Afghan territory when they were fighting the Taliban in Spin-Boldak. And although the Pakistani military denied that they were threatening them, they said they had taken necessary measures. So effectively admitting that they mobilized against Afghan forces operating on Afghan territory.
As you're saying, tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan nosediving. The latest, you mentioned the Afghan ambassador's daughter who was kidnapped and tortured. They've recalled the ambassador and diplomats for now. Just moving on to Warren Pratap says, what would be the position of Western countries from now onwards with respect to Afghanistan? David, I want you to talk a little bit about the UK. We've seen some developments there. Your defense secretary has said in an interview that, you're willing to deal with the Taliban with conditions, of course. And we saw Nick Carter possibly, flying in with the Chief of Army Staff, the Pakistani Chief of Army Staff, Bajwa, in May, I think, to meet President Ghani and together. I mean, not only did they fly, they actually met leaders together. What is that about?
Well, to talk about the Nick Carter contribution first, it's very clear because he was on the record on the day that President Biden made the announcement to withdraw the troops back in April this year. He was very clear in an interview on the BBC that this was not the decision that he would have wanted. And I think he was speaking for American generals in saying that. There's a strong sense in the military who fought the war, and Nick Carter spent more time in Afghanistan at the head of our armed forces than pretty well any other British soldier. He was there on 4 different deployments at different levels. First as a colonel back in right at the beginning in 2001, I interviewed him for my book, and I got some very colourful anecdotes of sort of camping in the sand at Bagram Air Base at the time that the Americans didn't really want the war to continue. That Rumsfeld, you'll remember, the American Secretary of Defense, was very keen on not having many troops on the ground. So the ones that were there were in tents. They weren't ever going to be in hard buildings. Well, of course, seen 20 years later that Bagram is like a city when they left it, because those hard buildings ultimately came. But what, from the beginning of that, Nick Carter as in a tent in the sand, ended up as deputy commander of international forces and got to know President Ghani very well. So there's a close personal link with President Ghani. When I was at a cricket match, actually, when Afghanistan were playing England in the World Cup in the north of England in Old Trafford a couple of years ago, President Ghani was there as a guest of Nick Carter. So it's a close personal relationship, and it's one that I think Carter is now exploiting with the very much with the support of the British government to try and see if there is a backdoor diplomacy to bring the Pakistani military on board with a different kind of solution, to try and change really the aperture of the Pakistani military. So I think it's, whether it's going to turn into a wider series of peace talks from that, I think it's really more about building a better atmosphere, building better relations, having another opportunity for the men to meet, potentially exploiting, as we understand from the report in The Guardian, they actually went to Doha as well. So there's the sense in which Carter is making sure that Bajwa knows what's going on, that this is not just government to government, but this is engaging the Taliban as well. So I think you're seeing from Britain a sense that they don't want some of the successes that they made in the war to be lost. They don't want the diplomatic successes to be lost. There's been significant progress in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. The war wasn't a waste, in terms of waste of time, in my view. Life expectancy is far higher than it was. Women's rights in Afghanistan are in a completely different place from where they were in 2001. Not just in the cities, it is not just a Western obsession, but also in the countryside. There was a very interesting Afghan Analyst Network report came out a couple of weeks ago, showing that in the countryside, Afghan women really do want a different sort of society. So I think, Western countries like Britain, European countries want to protect the benefits that they think they made to Afghanistan over the last 20 years, and Nick Carter's diplomatic efforts have to be seen in that light. As far as the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace's comments are concerned about dealing with the Taliban, whenever any military person or government minister in the West says, let's talk to the Taliban, there's always this great fuss. We are talking to the Taliban. Khalilzad, the Americans are talking to the Taliban in Doha. So I think, the political fuss around that's not really, of any value. I think, clearly engaging with the Taliban is something that any sensible Western governments are wanting to do, while they're continuing, and we're seeing this propaganda video here, they're continuing to promote themselves as this, really strong military force. And I'm afraid to say, I've been involved, as you mentioned, in some sort of support for strategic communications in Afghanistan. I'm afraid to say the Afghan government there's been real shortcomings in the way that they've responded to this. They don't speak with one voice. Everybody knows they're not a united government. There's the Abdullah side and the Ghani side. And there's been a lack of coherence in the government narrative and in building confidence for the Afghan people, and sort of threatening the free media at the same time as the Taliban have this very strong, united, coherent, 5-language broadcasting they're doing, allied with successful propaganda of the deed attacks of the sort that we saw in Kabul this morning at the beginning of Eid.
Yeah, well, that narrative about the Taliban being unified is also being questioned in terms of, the Haqqanis and the Quetta Shura, etc. But when you're talking about the UK and Pakistan, maybe Pakistan trusts the UK more than other countries, and that engaging with the Taliban is something that almost everybody is doing, led by the US and Khalilzad. But engaging with the Taliban is one. And I just want to take a question that one of our viewers also is trying to bring out in that. Where is the pressure from the UK on Pakistan to rein in the Taliban? Talking to Pakistan, being so-called trustworthy with them, talking to the Taliban is fine, but how is the UK doing that?
I agree with your caller. I mean, I don't speak for the government.
Absolutely. No.
I think that there is more pressure. It's difficult to put pressure on governments. Pakistan is a very, very large, aid recipient. There's a huge amount of money that goes particularly for education in Pakistan, and it's difficult to see that the United Kingdom is going to use that in any sort of conditional terms. So I think pressure. I think the decision has been made to on the part of the United Kingdom government to continue to try and have good relations with Pakistan in order to wield leverage rather than putting pressure on them in that sort of stiff way. And it's about keeping good relations with them and about trying to move them in a different direction and trying to frame the narrative in a different way. So, I mean, we've seen lots of Track 2 discussions being promoted, being funded by international organisations, including the United Kingdom. So I think there's a sense in Western countries and in the United Kingdom in particular, because of the long-term relations with Pakistan, which of course go back to the days of the Raj, and the sense, since 1947, that Pakistan has been a country that we've been able to deal with. that Britain will continue to have those relations. But I mean, I completely agree, and I can see the frustration from India in that approach, in not using that potential leverage in a stronger way.
Right. You talked about disunity among the Afghan political elite, and we've seen one of the reasons for them not being able to, to put up a united front. But how do you see the ANDSF performing in terms of both their training, their capabilities, the arm that they have, and there's a lot of reporting on taking back of areas that the Taliban has taken. How do you see the ANDSF and its morale? How do you see them performing?
I think it's a variety of things. Yeah, there's a variety of things going on the military front. Clearly, you've got the ANDSF regular forces, and they're demoralized. They've not been very, very well led. They've not been very well trained. In many places, they're not very well fed. The Taliban have offered them surrender deals without killing them. Although we've seen some very high-profile attacks where the Taliban have killed ex-ANA prisoners. So I think the regular army itself is demoralized, and I think, in a sense, the lack of a confident narrative from the top of the government is a problem in that. I think that, the government has not sort of led them in the way that they might have done in terms of defending the country. They're spread out in checkpoints rather than running in any sort of tactical warfare against the enemy. They tend to sit in these very static checkpoints right across the country, which are very vulnerable. But against that, there are other bits of the ANDSF. We've seen there an MD-530 and one of the Super Tucano planes that they've got, these light bombers, propeller planes. They're not jet, but they're very effective. And in fact, those light helicopters, which are an airframe that goes back to the Vietnam War, actually, right at the end of the Vietnam War, they were using those. And they're very effective in close combat, and they've been used very effectively by Afghan forces. They have high precision weapons as well, as we can see there. And alongside this, increasingly powerful air force, more than half of the weapons that were dropped from the air last year, when the American Air Force was still there, were dropped by the Afghan Air Force. So they've been effective on their own for a while. And alongside them, there's some 50,000 special forces now who are well-trained, well-armed, well-motivated, the best in the region, more of them coming out all the time. And I think the expectation, which is because of a growing expectation in the Western press that there'll be some sort of collapse of Afghanistan quickly, seems unlikely to me. It seems that, given the capacity of those forces, providing the political control remains as it is at the moment, and they don't fracture into old Mujahideen parties, which could of course happen. But there's a sense in the special force in particular of a coherent force, very well motivated to defend the country. But the other thing that I'd say, alongside the regular forces and the special forces, is you increasingly see armed militias in the countryside, supported, armed at some reluctance by the Afghan government, but armed now by the Afghan government. And we saw President Ghani this week going to Herat to Ismail Khan, one of the old warlords who he used to really try and exclude from the political space, and had some pretty strong words about Ismail Khan's involvement still in politics. But he was going to Herat last week to say, look, come back and get your soldiers out again, and let's see the militias working. So I think there's a sense of militias operating in the countryside. Panjshir Valley, the area northeast of Kabul, which never fell to the Taliban, never fell previously to the Russians. They're rearming now, and there's a sense of the Panjshiris certainly won't, give up against the Taliban. So I think it's going to be a much more difficult fight than the Taliban are making it at the moment. However, once you've got armed militias back out, then it's going to be much more difficult to retake the whole country again and to return to a sort of technocratic, democratic government, because those people who've taken power with arms will expect something in return.
How do you see India playing its foreign policy? unlike all the other countries, India had waited till the intra-Afghan negotiations began in September to at least put out feelers to the Taliban. That's what we hear. I mean, it's still not official. How do you see India playing its cards so far, and what should it be doing in the future?
Long-term ally of Afghanistan over the last 20 years and longer, of course. I mean, very strong, close. Avinash Paliwal's wonderful book on the Indian-Afghan relationship is should be read by any of your subscribers. But India's has, I think, something of a dilemma in terms of whether it really pushes its closeness and friendship with the Afghan government, risking, of course, provoking Pakistan, risking changing the narrative more in Pakistan. And I think balancing those is something perhaps that India is really facing. But they have a significant investment in Afghan democracy as much as Western countries do. I mean, I remember watching the Afghan parliament being built and going in and seeing that the Sikh foremen who were working with Afghan builders. It was Indian money, but it was also Indian labour. That built the place where Afghan democracy is now held. The relations with a number of different organisations right across the country, the industrial investment, the investment in dams, the Chabahar port, the way that India is operating to open up Afghanistan to the world because it's closed because of the bad relations with Pakistan. All of that is emotional and financial investment in the success of the country. But I think that might have to be balanced with the broader balance of relations in the region. And in a sense, one of the reasons for Pakistan justifying its support for the Taliban, and that's what it is for the Afghan Taliban, is because they see this. The last thing they want is Afghanistan to be an Indian backdoor, as it were, into Pakistan across the northwest frontier. So I think there's some balance of strategic thinking that is happening in India, and of course, if the Taliban take more ground, if the Taliban become a force that India is going to need to deal with, then that's going to be much more difficult.
You seem to be a picture of earlier when there was a U-turn of sorts in Indian foreign policy when we finally did give lethal weaponry, those meat choppers that you're seeing there. But like you mentioned, Ismail Khan and Ashraf Ghani going to Herat. Well, we've been dealing with all those who have been in the Afghan political elite, whether it's Ismail Khan, Ata Noor in the north, Marshal Dostum, his son, I guess, Mohake. But this new strand opening some kind of a channel with the Taliban, how do you see India? You're talking about a balance, but how does India do that? We're still talking about legitimacy of whatever dispensation in terms of political government comes to Kabul.
Well, I think it's going to be difficult for them, and I don't think anyone is expecting the Taliban to come to power, on the whole, in a hurry. But maybe there'll be some sort of deal in a couple of years' time where the Taliban are in charge of some part of the country, or are a political party, and clearly the international community more widely will deal with them. And I think it might be more difficult for India than some. Nobody could forget, and I certainly couldn't, because I was there in Kabul in 1996, 25 years ago, when Najibullah's body was hanged. Now, of course, his family lived in India, and a lot of the Afghan politicians going back to the communist days and during the Mujahideen days, Abdullah's family, I've spent a lot of time in India. A lot of Afghans go to India for higher education, and the sense of that sort of soft power relationship between the two countries, I think, is very important and will continue. And of course, India will successfully deal with the Taliban if the Taliban come into more authority, more power at some point. But it doesn't seem that it's going to be very easy to do in the short term.
David Loyn, absolutely appreciate your sharing your experiences and your expertise with us here on StratNews Global. I just want to take Matara again, who says, thanks, Mr. Loyn. The long war will only grow longer if Pakistan is not restrained.
Well, I mean, my book is only over the last 20 years from when the Americans arrived in 2001. And of course, for Afghanistan, the war has gone on much longer. And, let's just hope that at some point it can end. And you're wrong. Amitabh, it's been a real pleasure. And the quality of your viewers and readers, the quality of some of the questions has been great. So thank you for the opportunity.
David Loyn, it was completely our pleasure. Thank you again. And thanks for all our viewers who've participated in this discussion. Do continue doing so. Send us your feedback as well. You can help support us financially. There's a link in the YouTube descriptor to also follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for the latest news and analysis of foreign policy from an Indian perspective. This is The Gist. I'm Amitabh Revi on StratNews Global.